747 jumbo jet to Copenhagen, Denmark, where we transferred to 2 smaller planes as Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport couldn't handle the jumbo jet. My traveling companion was from London here, Peter Van Sickle, and we thought we were sharing a room, but as it turned out, his room was on the 5th floor and my room was on the 10th floor. As you can see, we had a few beverages. Some were given to us. Unbeknownst to us, there was no carbonated beverage to use as mix at that time in Russia. This was part of our hotel accommodation. This picture is taken from the 10th floor of our hotel window, looking out on the city of Moscow at about midnight on the 24th of September 1972. Looking down on Gorky Street, Red Square is in about the center of Moscow, and 12 avenues or streets radiate out like a wagon wheel, one being Gorky Street. One of the tours we were given was of the Moscow subway system. It's extremely deep, about 7 levels of subways. Moves about 2 million people to and from work. The stations were built by the various regiments of the Red Army, each competing with one another. This is a newer one, of course, but quite ornate work showing plaster of Paris, fresco, marble, and terrazzo, and statuary. Notice the marble or terrazzo floors and the statuary at the far end of the station. Certainly nothing like a subway station that we would find in North America. In the middle of this picture you'll see 2 guys make a pass, and I just happened to get that on film. The antiquated escalator system, very similar to the one in London's King's Cross station that caught fire recently. This subway station depicts paintings on the ceiling showing famous moments in Soviet air history, and the one I focus on shows the capture of the American spy plane, the U-2, piloted by Gary Powers. We saw fragments of that plane later on in a war museum. Moscow is a city of about 3.5 million people in 1972. This scene was shot just outside our hotel on Gorky Avenue, or Gorky Street. You notice about 6 lanes wide, divided boulevard, very little traffic. And that's Moscow University. This is on another tour on another day, a monument to Leo Tolstoy, the famous Russian poet and author. This is the new Maiden Convent, dates from approximately 1450. Portions of it were under renovation or restoration. The gold-plated or gilt onion domes are prevalent almost everywhere, and the bell tower of that same convent. The unusual decoration along the top of the wall caught my eye, and the fact that the place was overgrown in brush. A long shot of Moscow University. That large circular building in the foreground is Lenin Stadium. Seats 105 persons for soccer games. This is the main entrance to Moscow University. Central tower is 40-odd stories high. About 13,000 students from other countries, mostly African countries at all times. Quite a beautiful day and a beautiful sight. We're looking across the banks of the Moscow River to what is known as an area called Luge, and that center building in the center of the picture is where the ice hockey games took place. That's the Luge Ice Palace. Luge means reclaimed from swamp. There's another shot of Lenin Stadium where the soccer games take place. Coming up on the right, you'll see a ski jump, which they use all year round. In the summer, it's coated with a Teflon surface to make it nice and slippery. And the woman in gold is our guide, Lucia. One of our travel mates. This is the Kremlin Wall. That's the water tower, one of the 33 towers in the Kremlin Wall. That's the Soviet Parliament buildings. And the Cathedral of the Annunciation, the Cathedral of the Assumption, the Cathedral of St. Peter the Archangel, all inside the Kremlin. And coming into Red Square, you see a glimpse of St. Basil's Cathedral. 9 little chapels around a central core, built under the order of Peter the Great, about 1570. The Spassky Tower, one of the main towers in the Kremlin Wall. We're on our way to the hockey game, I believe the first hockey game. There's a quick shot of a cruise boat in the Moscow River. We're coming into Luge, to the Ice Palace. The stadium held 15,000 people, 12,000 Russians and 3,000 Canadians. The first game they sat us all together and we out-cheered them. And we had a few famous travel mates in our group. And here's a shot of one I'm sure you'll recognize, Rocket Richard. Of course, you'll notice the famous netting around the end of the rink rather than the plexiglass, like we were used to. The rebounds come off there, something fantastic. I think Ken Dryden played goal for Canada that night. And coming up here is a Russian goal. You'll see the huge red light go on. There's the huge light on the left. This is the Colomensko Wood Museum, which is about 15 miles outside Moscow. That's the only portion of the original palace or fortification remaining. It was principally constructed of wood, and there's a model of what the entire palace used to look like. And on display here were many artifacts dating from the early Russian days and showing how they utilized their most abundant natural resource, wood. All these gilt religious objects were carved from wood, but they have vandals there too. Notice the noses all broken off, the religious statues. And this monument was a reconstruction of one of Peter the Great's hunting homes or palaces outside Moscow. This is the interior of the cabin. And that's an old replica of a wooden prison. They simply removed the stairway. The prisoners kept on the upper floor. All these buildings were contained in a park-like setting and an amateur artist at work. This is the interior of Ostakino Palace, O-S-T-A-K-I-N-O, one of only 3 theater palaces in the world. That means they have their own theater. And everything here is of wood. They utilize plaster of Paris polished highly to give the appearance of marble. But it's all wood, other than the glass, of course, chandeliers. This was owned by one of the early czars and dates from approximately 1650. That's the front or main entrance to Ostakino Palace. And across the street, his private chapel. This is the interior of the Goom store, one of the largest department stores in all the world. It's 3 floors high, 3 long galleries, and in each gallery there's hundreds of these little alcoves where they sell anything from soup to nuts with no semblance of order. Underwear is usually beside tires. And each gallery, we're looking down one of them, is a half mile long. So to go down and back is a mile, and 3 floors is 3 miles, and to do all 3 galleries is 9 miles. And we went to the opera one night to see an Italian opera, Rigoletto, performed performed entirely in Russian. Although we couldn't understand a word of what was said or sung, we knew exactly what had happened just by the actions of the actors. And this building is often used for important world meetings and conferences inside the Kremlin. And during the intermission, we were able to get a glass of beer and a piece of sausage, or caviar and champagne, whatever suited your taste. This is suburbia Moscow. Most of these high-rises are walk-ups. And quite often, just above the first floor, you'll see a huge net to catch falling chunks of concrete, which results from the extreme cold. Being so far inland, they don't have any water as a moderating influence. And many times it's 50 below zero. This is about 25 miles out from Red Square. Now, the Russians don't officially recognize any religion, but they do allow some Russian Orthodox churches to practice in each area of the city. And this one was open, and we were taken here as a bit of a tour, but unbeknownst to the guide, a funeral was in place. There were hundreds of beggars everywhere we went. They were quite happy with a ruble or a stick of gum. This is the Trotsky Tower, meaning the Trinity. It's the tallest of the 33 towers in the Kremlin Wall. This is inside the Kremlin now, one of the war museums. And the front of the theater inside the Kremlin, and the domes from the Assumption, the Annunciation, and St. Peter the Archangel cathedrals. These churches are constantly under restoration. When Napoleon ransacked Moscow, he stabled his animals in these cathedrals. And at the rear there is the bell tower of Ivan the Terrible. And on the ground behind it sits a huge bell, which was cast in Belgium. And when brought to Moscow, they found it was too big to go into the tower. Extremely cold and windy and wet day. These churches all date from about 1500. Again, that's the front of the theater inside the Kremlin where we saw the opera. And the Trotsky Tower. This is a Russian Expo or USSR Economic Achievement Grounds. That's a monument to the space travelers, stainless steel. Now this grounds is huge, 150 to 200 acres, and a pavilion from all the various businesses and economies in the Russian culture. We had only a couple of hours here. Extremely cold and wet day. One would need a week to cover this, just as if one would need a week to see all of Expo 87 in Vancouver. The Vostok 1, the rocket that put Yuri Gagarin into space. That's the transport building. That word is transport, USSR. And the Ilyushin jet, similar to the American or Boeing 707, that word is cosmos, or space, and inside it was filled with satellites and all sorts of things recovered from space. We had an extremely difficult time because we couldn't read the signs or traffic signs because of the different alphabet. $20 million horsepower from that Vostok 1 rocket. That's where they sell the piva, or the beer. Peter writing home, send food. I lost 30 pounds in 10 days. The food was that terrible. This was one of the war museums where they displayed their latest achievements and some of their past achievements. And that mosaic behind the head of Lenin is constructed entirely of stones about the size of your thumbnail. Depicts the victory of the Russian army in the Second World War. There's captured Nazi battle flags, and over there the women do all the heavy work. There's a couple of ditch diggers. And there's a good example of post-1900 housing in the foreground and post-1970 housing in the background. And that's a modern Russian car. Another shot of St. Basil's Cathedral. Legend has it when the cathedral was finished, Ivan asked if anything could be more beautiful, and the architect said yes, and when they answered yes, he had them executed. This is Red Square again, of course, taken from the terrace of the Rossiya Hotel, one of the largest hotels in all of Russia and indeed in all of the world, and a long shot of St. Basil's Cathedral. Some of the hockey players stayed in this hotel and had a few laughs and stories to tell. And this was a theater, movie theater. And there I am trying to catch a little supper again. One of the barmaids at one of the hotels where we had a few vodkas and mungo juice. And last night it snowed. When we come out of the hockey game, we were all soaked, ankle deep in wet snow. As you can see on some of the roofs, there's still some traces of snow. This was just late September, you'll remember. We certainly weren't dressed or prepared for that type of weather. An overcast and cold and wet and windy day. This is that theater again, which was just down the street from our hotel. And a monument to Alexander Pushkin. And another view of Red Square and the Spassky Tower. Where the clock is used to be a bust of Jesus Christ, and Spassky is the Russian word for Savior. And this is Lenin's tomb there in front of the wall, and those white slabs of marble are seats for dignitaries when the military parades go through Red Square. And all those white markings on the cobblestones are so the soldiers can keep formation during these military parades. And that's the Russian word for Lenin. This is Lenin's tomb now. They have a ceremonial changing of the guard here, just like at Elizabeth's Palace. Now you remember I showed you the inside of the GUM store. This is the outside, but spanning down only half of it. That tower is in the center of the store, so this is just half the length of the GUM store. Now we're getting ready to watch the changing of the guard. Now notice the age of these soldiers, and notice how they carry or balance their rifles. This is the elite of the Russian army. This is an honor. You see, the rifles are not touching their shoulders. They're on guard for an hour, and then they are off for an hour, and they take that shift for 24 hours, and then they're off again. And they change every hour on the hour, and as they walk back to the tower, I'll scan up to the clock, and you'll see it's just 1 minute after 3 as they complete the changing of the guard. We were nearly trampled to get this shot. And there they break stride and go into the Spassky Tower. Stalin had the bust of Christ removed from the tower and replaced with the clock face. And this is on Gorky Street, just outside our hotel. I had been awakened in the night by a crowd on the street at about 3 o'clock in the morning. So there's the remains of that crowd in the morning, and I discovered that they were there for an opportunity to buy a man's shirt. They weren't sale priced, they were just available. And some of the older Moscow housing. This is known as the Needle. It was the tallest freestanding structure in the world until the CN Tower was completed. 1,100 feet up is a revolving restaurant called Seventh Heaven. And there's our gang. We were not allowed a menu, we were served a meal. Most times it was sautéed gristle and fat. And this is the Moscow Circus. Now if you ever get a chance to see the Russian circus, don't miss it. They consider it as much of an art as the ballet or opera. And it's performed as such, complete with an orchestra. Now I'm using high-speed film with no lights, and you'll see things here that I could not see with the naked eye that night. I've tried to get a little bit of each act, rather than all of one act. Unfortunately, there's a glare from the spotlights. And the Russians love the animal acts. These kids are on roller skates. This guy's a strong man now. Wait till you see the other fellas handle one of those 3 balls. See, it doesn't bounce much, does it? And this act was performed above us with no net. And the finale of this act demonstrates pretty good timing. And the bears were great. They were right in the crowd. He's trying to do the triple. And this portion was performed in total blackness or purple light, and they had slashes of luminescent red and green on their outfits, and all we could see were those slashes flying through the black. Now we're in Copenhagen, Denmark. The city is built on 25 or 30 islands, and this is one of the channels between the islands, or a man-made lake. And the city recently wanted to drain this particular lake to make a parking lot. However, it was voted out. The Tivoli Gardens. However, the fair had just closed the day before we arrived in Copenhagen. There it is again, the Tivoli. And the town hall and town square. Several days later, we encountered a tremendous demonstration here, rejecting their vote to join the common market. And that's the front of our hotel, the Sheraton, Copenhagen. About $125 a day for a single room. This is the Carlsberg Museum, donated to the city by the brewery. And notice the little sidewalk off to the right for bicyclists and motorcyclists. And lots of people live on boats all year round. Lots of canals, just like Amsterdam and Venice. And these are some of the state buildings. And the 3 crowns there signify the union of the 3 Scandinavian countries. This is the gardens just outside the royal apartments. This is Christianborg Castle. And the Parliament buildings. And the maroon house in the middle was Hans Christian Andersen's home. And that's the speedboats, or hydrofoils, that we took over to Sweden one day. About 75 miles across the top of the water. This is Ameliaborg Castle. It's actually 4 residences. So if any of the in-laws come to visit, they got their own palace. And there's the Little Mermaid of Copenhagen Harbor. Not near what you'd imagine. Only about 6 feet out, and not near as large.
Olympics took the spotlight in 1988, and Ben Johnson experienced both ends of the emotion.